So I'm going to be presenting on the session called Brave Steps, Bright Horizons, Teacher Strategies for Supporting Resilience in English Language Learners. And I want to just kind of dive right in because we don't have as much time as it sometimes feels like a lot of time, and then you start talking, suddenly it's not as much. So I want to set the stage a little bit on the challenge and then dive into some specific strategies and the sort of research behind them that I think can help educators have some ideas, have some tools that they can use to address this challenge of resilience with their students. So, this moment is kind of an interesting one to be talking about this topic. Mental health conditions in general are on the rise for children and adolescents and adults. The World Health Organization, for example, says that mental disorders now account for about 1 out of every 6 years lived with disability. There's a study in the Lancet, a medical journal, just last year. They had a lot where the researchers looked at survey responses from a lot of different people, over 150,000 responses from all over the world. And they found that as many as 1 in 2 people may experience a major sort of episode, like a mental disorder, such as a major depressive disorder episode or substance use disorder. So this is just a common thing. Now, part of that is that there's a greater awareness and more sort of resources available for people. So it could be that we always had some challenges and now we're just kind of understanding that. But either way, it's kind of clear that there's significant challenges there. Similarly, there's kind of a moment of challenge happening in academics generally. Academic performance is generally down. If you look at the results from the PISA test, which tracks countries' performance on standardized assessments, there's just sort of a trend where school systems across the world are having trouble and producing lower scores in math, reading, and science. And that's partly attributable to COVID-19 and all the disruptions to the education systems that caused, but it actually kind of accelerated a trend that we've already seen happening from before COVID-19 became the pandemic that we sort of lived through and are still living through. There's some evidence that part of that challenge is maybe due to technology, and maybe social media is a component of that we want to be careful and think about. There's obviously tons of positive impacts of the widespread adoption of things like smartphones, laptops, and even the social media networks that are prevalent on them and that people use, but they can make it really difficult to balance the demands of our very limited kind of attention and abilities to regulate ourselves, particularly in academic settings. So I would love to get your thoughts on this right now. You guys who are teaching students, are you seeing any changes in your students from prior years? If so, what are you seeing? I just would love to see you type into the chat and stop and take a moment to think about that. Yeah, are you seeing any changes in your students from prior years? And if so, what are those changes you're seeing? Shorter attention spans, need their phone. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people talking about the anxiety and phones. I saw also interest. Oh, they're also more open to new technology, so that's positive. But generally, yeah, some lack of motivation, apathy, addiction to phones, lack of interest, difficult reading. Yeah, there's a lot about the attention spans, not as much commitment to reading longer texts in different sort of quitting a little quicker. That's some of the stuff we want to talk about a little bit, but I think that's also an interesting question to kind of dive in more about the technology side of that. There's some interesting research about how people don't comprehend as deeply when they read things on screens, which might be part of the challenge there. This is great. Thank you for typing. I would read them all day, but I think we probably should also speak. So let me move on a little bit. So let's dive in to thinking about this challenge. So like anybody with a task to do nowadays, I wanted to see if ChatGPT could help me to find a way to illustrate some of the ideas I want to cover today. And what you see up on the slide is what I came up with, which is interesting. I want to talk about a little bit. It also provided like a longer explanation of what it's showing. But what I want to just talk about is how do I think something like this relates to the idea of resilience? So first, you have 2 students who are having a very different experience, even though they're in the same classroom. And I think for educators, this will hopefully resonate. I know it does from my time teaching. There's going to be some students, excuse me, there's some students who are happy, capable, persistent, others who may be disengaged much more quickly, or they're sort of already given up before they really started. They don't appear to be trying as hard. And we sometimes can say, oh, they're not motivated or something like that. I want to talk about that idea a little bit more. But for the purposes of what I really want to focus on today, I want to kind of think about two students that are roughly equivalent. Of course, in the real world, no two students are really, truly, roughly equivalent, right? Everybody's a person, everybody has their unique strengths, weaknesses, things that make them who they are. But I'm going to be talking about research-based results, theory, strategies, and research frequently tries its best to make those kinds of comparisons as cleanly as it can by accounting for as much as it can about individual differences. If we look at this picture, we could see that the sad, dour student, maybe they're in a class that's way above their current abilities, or it's being taught in a language that they don't know, or there's lots of other reasons that maybe they're sort of not going to be likely to succeed no matter what. The happy student, I don't really know what ChatGPT was thinking there. They don't appear to have pupils. That's interesting. Maybe they have superpowers. They're very different. Like, these two students look very different. But what I really want to think about is the kind of case where we have two students who, again, are roughly equivalent in terms of, say, prior ability, the baseline, but some of them seem more likely to succeed than others. And I want to kind of unpack what are some of those factors that lead to that, and what are some strategies to help maybe make more students have those kinds of behaviors, those kinds of attitudes, those kind of habits that maybe help them be more set up for success, again, given if we could try as best as we can to kind of equate on prior abilities. And to do that, I'll talk about some specific strategies. I've kind of outlined these quickly on that first slide, but we're going to talk about helping people feel confident and capable, connected to purpose and to values, socially connected as well, and having the ability to kind of identify and deal positively with negative emotions when they do happen. So really what we're trying to think about is, how do we help people be resilient, meaning have the ability to persist in making progress towards their goals while regulating their emotions, while maintaining a sense of well-being, or, if they lose that for a little bit, being able to rebalance, return to that kind of a state soon after. Okay. So if you've been in sort of education world for a while, you may have heard this term. It's kind of one of these terms from psychology that have escaped into the wider world. We'll have a couple of those today, I think. This one is self-efficacy, and it has a sort of popular understanding as meaning kind of confidence in yourself or your abilities. That's not quite precisely exactly what researchers tend to mean when they try to look at it. Researchers tend to conceptualize it a little bit more specifically, meaning how well do you think you can do a very particular goal, or achieve a particular goal, or complete a particular task. So it's a little bit more grounded. It's not, people can kind of think about it more broadly in terms of what's your self-efficacy for a wider domain, like, say, academics broadly, right? And then it's kind of reframing what is it that you're asking about. But a lot of time what you get is people who, to researchers who want to assess this or try to understand this in their studies, they'll use kind of self-reports, questionnaires, where people are given something that they're supposed to try to do, or at least actually not even try to do, but gauge, do they think they could do it? And then measure themselves, how do you feel about it? So 1 to 5 kind of a scale, 1 being, oh, I don't think I could do that no matter what, and 5 being, yeah, I could do that easy, no worries, that's not very precise language, but that's kind of the idea here. And so to demonstrate that, I want to actually give you guys an example. So without actually doing anything, that is, don't solve anything I put up on the screen, these are going to be kind of in the domain of math. Quickly just assess, like, how comfortable do you think you are solving these kinds of problems? So again, I'm just going to put up some questions. Don't try to solve it. Just quickly say 1, totally don't know how to do it, to 5, yep, that's easy, no worries. How do you feel when you see a problem like that? Okay, here we go. All right, chat, see what people see. Some 3s, some 1s, some 3s to 4s. So some people feeling confident, some people feeling less confident, easy. Yeah. So that's kind of a feeling you can kind of understand. Just you look at them, you get a sense, okay, yes, I can do it. No, that's actually still kind of challenging. So again, 5 being, in this case, we'll say really easy. 1 being, oh, I don't think I could do that no matter what. So here's another set. All right. So for the second set, do the same kind of thing. Check in with yourself. How does that feel compared to the first one? Also start noticing, is there any differences in how you sort of react, or physiologically, or anything? Okay. Seeing people want to, again, don't have to solve them. If you do, if you want to put that, I see some answers coming in. I was wondering how long it would take before that happened. Here we go. So I'm going to do one more. All right. Again, same question. Does that feel something like I could do that in my sleep, 5, or, oh, that's pretty challenging. Yeah, I think that last one feels a little bit more challenging to people, generally speaking. Like I saw frowny face, that kind of explains it. And yeah, I think, I hope this illustrates kind of this idea of the feeling you get, right? That feeling, that's kind of what we mean when we talk about self-efficacy. Now, obviously, this is related to your actual skill, right? You know yourself, you know if you have solved problems like these before, you know some things about math and whether you know these rules and things like that. There's kind of that metacognitive, I used that word earlier, but it's this ability to think about your own thinking, which includes kind of gauging your own understanding. But like, I want to put that aside for a second, because what research has found is when you can control, as well as researchers can, for baseline ability, for your ability to solve these kinds of problems, you do tend to see that people who have a higher self-efficacy, who feel more confident, actually do better. They persist longer. They have a sort of better emotional response and can kind of handle any setbacks they experience. And they do ultimately then achieve more. They can answer more of those types of questions right. Again, even controlling for the fact that presumably if you had two students, one with the higher self-efficacy and lower, but they had the same background knowledge, you're still seeing that benefit for the students who come in feeling that higher self-efficacy about themselves. So given that, it's useful to think about what are some of the techniques we could use to maybe help students feel a little bit more confident. So obviously one is make them a little bit better at this stuff, right? Learning itself is going to help a person feel more confident, but let's also think about what are some of these other factors that influence it. So one of those is the idea of modeling, which is basically seeing how you do tasks like that. And there's, as I was saying, kind of a cognitive component to that. If I walked you through how to solve that hard math problem and I explained kind of what the steps are and the rules are, there's a cognitive benefit. That's just learning. That's learning from worked example, right? Somebody showing you how to do it, giving you the reasons, and then you can kind of practice it and get better yourself. So there's kind of a cognitive element there. But again, even without that, the modeling aspect can also help people with the sort of affective side of it, to see, particularly if it's somebody that you identify with or you kind of are familiar with and you feel comfortable with, and somebody that you think, yeah, that they're kind of like me broadly. You see that person going through this process of solving a problem like that, maybe even talking about what they're thinking, what their difficulties in a problem like that, what their first emotional reaction was, and how they got over sort of maybe a negative, anxious kind of feeling to start with. All of that can help people, whoever the target here is, the student, to actually start to feel more capable, have that self-efficacy in this domain as well. So if that's like that model is coming from, say, a teacher, that's good. That's already something. But if it can come from somebody that they truly like identify with, meaning say a peer in the class that they are familiar with, they like, or maybe a former student who comes in and is like them in some way, came through the same school, those kinds of things can all help a person see that, yes, it's true. It's possible to have self-efficacy in this area, to do things like this, even though it may feel hard on the first impression. Another is creating kind of an environment and an expectation of success. I'll talk a little bit more about this kind of idea of the environment a few times. But if you feel like others around you are similar to you and you guys are all kind of capable and you're all seeing yourselves as the people who are dealing with challenges in this class together and working through it, have that shared definition of success that isn't just, oh yeah, I can solve that like that without even thinking about it, but having that shared definition be something around hard work, getting through any difficulties, sticking with it, then that kind of environment can reinforce this idea that that's what it means in this to feel that self-efficacy in this kind of a situation. And the last thing I'll mention is improving the affective, the sort of emotional experience that people are having. If people just aren't feeling their best, whether due to a lot of reasons, feeling nervous, feeling stressed, feeling maybe just tired or hungry, they maybe just don't have the same kind of cognitive resources to spend on the task itself. So as a person managing the classroom, you could think about what are some of the ways we could help students reset if some of those things are true. If they're feeling stressed, is there a way to take a break, maybe clear their minds, do some breathing exercises or something to just kind of change that that sort of beginning state that's not really conducive to a good learning experience, and that sort of self-efficacy feeling. If they're hungry, can they get a snack? If they're tired, can we do a minute of jumping jacks or something to get the blood flowing? Whatever it may be, I'm trying to reset if there is a sort of starting baseline of that kind of negative feeling can help. So that idea of self-efficacy is sort of, it's I think a really useful one to have in mind. it's this kind of like a story you tell yourself about what's going on here, right? Like, ooh, I know how to do this, or no, I don't. And again, it's kind of independent. It's kind of there's something that's related to your prior abilities, but there's this element of it that's kind of independent of that, and that can have an influence on how you do. Um, there are other kind of theories and ideas from social psychology that are similar in the sense of they're kind of about how you frame things, how you kind of understand what's going on in this environment. So another one of these is kind of what fundamentally do your students think is happening in the classroom as they're practicing, as they're going through these learning activities? Do they think that fundamentally what they're doing is revealing who's good at this domain, at learning English, for example, and who's not? Or do they fundamentally think that everybody's there to kind of get better and learn and develop those abilities? And this question relates to the idea of growth mindset, which is another one of those social psychological terms that have kind of escaped into the wider world of everything, but education in particular. And it's based on research that's pioneered by Carol Dweck. And that research used the jargon term of implicit theories of intelligence, which I think is interesting and useful to break down. So in that case, what we're talking about is implicit, meaning it's something people don't necessarily think consciously about. It's more of that kind of a story, that framing that they bring, that they use to interpret what's going on. It's kind of a more of an intuitive thing. The other element there is theory of intelligence. And what does that mean? That means it's the framing story specifically about how does intelligence work? What is intelligence? What are abilities even really sort of made of, so to speak? And what she and other researchers have documented is that people tend to fall into one of two positions. It's kind of a continuum, but people can kind of be grouped into kind of more or less these two camps. Of course, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but we'll go with it for now. Some people have what they call a fixed mindset, where they think that abilities for a domain are fixed or kind of set, or kind of an entity. It's like a certain amount you have or you don't have, where it's sort of reflecting something that's true about the person. So you could hear this in phrases like, I'm just not a math person. Or the sort of positive version of that, like, I'm always been a math person. I'm really great at that. Like, that's just kind of who I am. And you can see this in particular when people start to struggle. They might say things like, I can't do any better than this. I'll never be good at this. It means I can't do this, right? Those mistakes are indicative of the fact you don't have this ability. Other people think that their fundamental abilities in whatever domain you're talking about can actually change. And that is what gets labeled a growth mindset. And that means that with practice, with effort over time, you can improve, right? And this is sort of reflected in ideas and things like, oh yeah, mistakes are actually a normal part of the process. They help me learn. I might find this hard now, but I'm going to get better with time and effort. And another thing that's kind of important is thinking about like strategies and things like that help people do that. Why this is interesting and why this is important is that research has actually found that they're, again, sort of like self-efficacy, where you might have people who are roughly equivalent on their baseline ability, but people who have different thoughts and beliefs, these kind of stories they tell themselves, actually do produce different outcomes. And there's some evidence that people with a growth mindset tend to do better in academic environments. They have greater interest in the topics, greater persistence, and ultimately in some of this research, they find that it is associated with improved achievement. And so this research has become really popular. One reason I think is that it's intuitively kind of makes a lot of sense, that people have these kind of different ideas, and that means that it kind of tells a good story about itself, which is great for spreading the idea more broadly. And the other reason is I think it kind of intuitively, if you hear this, it sounds like a switch that can be flipped, right? You could say, oh, well, if we could just get those kids who are feeling more fixed mindset to be more growth mindset, like that will just be great. We can just figure out what is it that flips that switch. So I want to talk a little bit about that idea in a second, but I just want to start with some caveats more broadly. So first of all, one thing that's worth noting is these beliefs tend to be domain specific. So it's easier in some ways to think about in certain contexts being growth oriented versus having that fixed mindset. So athletics is a really good example. If you think about, the best athletes, yes, you might understand that they have some natural abilities that maybe differentiate them, but they still have to work incredibly hard to get as good as they get, right? Michael Jordan practiced a lot. Kobe Bryant practiced a lot, right? You kind of know that about them, and you can just see that in kind of the output, right? In the fact that they became so great. You could think of any sport and you can kind of see that really easily. Similarly, a person may feel like they're just not a math person, just not something they could do, but they might have had an experience with, say, sports or art or other things where they do kind of have an experience that that tells themselves and that they can kind of understand as being indicative of the fact that they actually got better with practice, with effort, all those things. So that's kind of an important caveat. The other thing I want to mention is that there has been some research on this idea of like changing people's growth mindset, and it's had some mixed results. Some studies do find a benefit, others don't. Some researchers really have pointed out that the effect maybe is particularly good for students who are most at risk in some way, have lower achievement, or have had prior outcomes that aren't so great, but perhaps not as useful for those who are already set up to succeed in the environment. I don't want to get too deeply into all that about the research, but what I do want to mention is kind of some aspects of that research and some differences that I want to highlight. So a lot of that research, what they do is they basically do direct instruction on these ideas. They tell people kind of like what I'm doing now, maybe about the difference between growth mindset and fixed mindset. Sometimes they focus in particular on like using some neuroscience based explanations. So saying things like when you learn, your brain is actually forming new synapses. So that's kind of a way of understanding that you are actually changing something fundamental about yourself when you're learning. You can also use an analogy like your brain is like a muscle, right? Getting back to that athletics idea. And then they can use some techniques to help students kind of really believe that, adopt these ideas. But what I often suggest, instead of talking directly to your students about this, which could be useful, is to really focus more on the climate of the classroom and what it conveys to your student. So, similar to what we talked about for self-efficacy, are there ways we can change aspects of the classroom environment to kind of align with the idea of development? And that could be things about the grades, the assignments you give out. Are students able to do revisions and turn things back in and still get more and more points, for example? What is the sort of thing that gets praised in the class? Is it, oh, this student got 100, and so everybody should know that that's the greatest score and everybody should try to get a score like that? Or is it more about the practice, the effort, the improvement, the development over time? Oh, this student has made a lot of progress and that's worth celebrating. So thinking about more of that environment and the way you kind of craft that, I think is going to be an even more impactful way to try to help students feel that growth orientation rather than just kind of talking at them about it. So, one of the things we saw in the comments I saw earlier is one of the differences some people are seeing is that students have low motivation right nowadays. And I always want to stop it for a moment and think about like, what do we mean by that? Because I hear that all the time. And there's sort of this idea of like, this student is motivated and this student isn't motivated. And I want to kind of push back a little bit on that idea and think about what is motivation really? It's really about kind of the direction and the amount of energy you're putting towards something. So what is it that you're choosing to focus on? How much? And when we say somebody's low motivated, stay in one context, what we're really saying is like, they're low motivated in that context, right? Not that they generally have like an entity view of it, that they have low motivation. It's just this domain isn't working for them. They're not getting themselves excited and motivated in this context. And how do they figure that out? Like, what is it that makes them not engage in this way? And researchers looking into motivation, they basically have a lot of different theories and frameworks that talk about kind of what are the unconscious calculations people are making to come to this sort of intuitive sense of how motivated they are and kind of have that response. And one of the theories that I think is really interesting and relevant for educational context is called expectancy value theory. So it breaks out these two elements. And one of these is expectancy, which is basically expectations of success, similar to self-efficacy, like we talked about. But there's other elements that go into expectancy too. For example, perceived control, right? Can I actually do anything to get to the outcome that I want? Like, if the student is thinking that their teacher is always asking questions on their test that they're just not prepared for, they're definitely going to feel less motivated to even study, right? It won't be clear what to do. So regardless of self-efficacy, if you're not going to have an impact on the outcome, why do? But I want to focus a little bit more on the idea of value, which again, multifaceted. One of them is fun, right? Intrinsic value. How much do I enjoy doing this? And this is where that idea of motivation, I think, comes in, right? People can find motivation during all parts of the day, even when they shouldn't be doing it, to do things like look at their phone and go to social media or play a video game or something like that. And that's because it just feels good, right? You get value out of doing it. You get fun, intrinsic value out of doing it. But I think another really critical element that a lot of interesting research has been done on is around the idea of utility value, which is relevance. How relevant do I think this is to me? And if you're like me and you're thinking, oh, I want to help students, see the relevance, you might first think about ways you as an instructor can do that for the student. Think about relevant examples or drawing connections for them. Hey, what you're learning in class, you're going to be able to use over here to do these things. Or, hey, let's pull in some examples of things you're already interested in, like say the local sports team, and build that into the exercises in some ways. That can work. It's not a bad idea. But what I found really interesting is research that has tried a different approach, which is basically asking students themselves to kind of come up with those kinds of connections. And I want to talk a little bit more in depth on one of these kinds of studies, just to give an example of what that might look like. So imagine you have students who go through some content. In this case, they worked with high school science students working primarily, I think it was on biology concepts in the cohort that this study was with. And you can imagine a question like this: summarize the main parts of the topic concept you just went over, whatever it is, digestive system or something like that. What the researchers looked at was adding a sort of supplement to that. So some students only did the control, some did that, and then followed it up with this other kind of prompt where it asks them, apply this topic or concept to your life, to the life of someone you know. How might the information be useful to you or a friend, relative in your daily life? How does this learning affect maybe your future plans? And this was a sort of thing where they did it sort of embedded in the normal classroom practices, something that doesn't take too long. The students completed about 5 of these over the course of a semester on average. And it was very short, about a paragraph or something that students would write and get some credit in the class for doing. And I'm showing results from like one study from about 15 years ago, but there's been a ton of research since then, kind of continuing to replicate that effect and kind of expanding and finding more nuances in there. But what I want to show first is what the impact of a condition like that, or a test like that, is for those with low expectations of success. So remember, your motivation, according to this theory, is the function of both how likely you are to succeed, how your kind of self-efficacy, how you feel about, are you going to be able to do it? And also the value, how much am I getting out of this? How fun is it? All of the things that go into value. And what you see is that for those students with low expectations for success who maybe need a boost to really feel motivated, you see the relevance condition helped increase their interest, and it increased by a fair amount, I'd say, their actual achievement in the course. So I think this is a really interesting study where you kind of turn it on its head, right? You ask the students to come up with what is it that is useful for you out of all this, and you see this really big impact. And what's interesting is for those students who come in with those high expectations of success, who maybe don't need that extra boost of motivation to kind of get what they need to sort of stick with what's going on, you don't actually see the same kind of impact at all. So this is one of those cases where, I think you can help the students who need the help the most, which I think is interesting. One other idea from the world of sort of motivation I want to talk about is another kind of connection, which is between a person's own values, identity, who they are, and kind of who they are at school. Sometimes people feel like those aren't the same, right? The context of learning is different than the context of everything outside of school, similar to what we were just saying about making those connections. But one of the reasons for that, particularly for students from underrepresented backgrounds who may have, they may have doubts about even belonging in the academic environment they're in, or having the sort of resources, that everything they need to succeed in that kind of environment, having that kind of pressure, feeling like, oh, I don't want to live up to some kind of negative ideas about me, can kind of take away the mental energy and resources that people need to actually focus on their learning and do well. And so researchers like Jeff Cohen and others have found a benefit from helping students do what they call self-affirm by connecting what's really important to them to kind of who they are in that context of school. And so I'll just show you one example from the Character Lab, which is a great resource. You can check out their website. They take a lot of great ideas from this psychology research broadly and produce some really nice resources for instructors and others to understand those ideas and to have kind of like worksheets and things they can use. So there's an example of a worksheet like this, where you can ask people to read a list of values, think about each one, circle the ones that are most important, and then spend a few sentences thinking about like, why is that so important to you? And that, again, reaffirms that person, who they are, even in this context where maybe they won't necessarily make that connection usually. And the research has found that this can be particularly impactful and can help students sort of set themselves up on a trajectory for success. So we talked a little bit about different kinds of connections, right? Connections between who you are at school and outside, and your interests and the relevance of things and what's going on at school. I also want to talk about connection within the classroom, like socially with the other people around you. Education can sometimes feel pretty solitary, right? Particularly in this emerging age of AI. but I think going back to other technologies, there's kind of this idea that students can learn really well if they sit in front of a computer, and that's kind of how they're going to learn. They're going to interact with the device, and that's kind of where the interaction comes from. That's an oversimplification, but there are some people who are particularly touting that as a kind of revolution, just like earlier generations touted just the computer without AI, and before that, television, before that, radio, right? Movies, Thomas Edison was a big proponent that movies were going to change education in a profound way. There was not going to be a need for teachers, that kind of thing. It's not going to happen, I don't think, either nowadays. But I do want to kind of say that part of the reason it's not going to happen is I think this social element of learning is really important. There's a lot of research on that from a cognitive side. So having dialogues with people is a really important way to learn more deeply, to kind of push each other's knowledge beyond where either one of you might individually go. But there's also, especially in this context of resilience, it's worth noting the kind of emotional affective side, right? People feel more connected, they have that sense of belonging, they're going to be more resilient to the challenges that they face. So how could we think about helping build that kind of environment and helping students feel that kind of connection? So one thing that I've found in the research is pretty consistent is sort of expectations. So people should know kind of what is expected of them, what those expectations are for how everybody interacts in the class. This is one of those places where stuff that's usually implicit, right? Things that we kind of assume are the way things work, or we want to model from ourselves. It's actually worth considering, how do we maybe make it a little bit more explicit? How do we set those expectations verbally in ways that are clear, that everybody kind of can understand? So think about talking about this with your students. What are some of the ways, what is it that you want your classroom to feel like and why? And show how you're going to interact and how you expect others to kind of have that baseline understanding. One thing that research has found is really interesting, I think is really interesting, that is beneficial, is to kind of actually script some of the interactions. It can feel a little bit awkward, but particularly for students who aren't used to engaging with one another, it can really help kind of streamline and get people going in that process. And there's a whole research field on computer-supported collaborative learning, which is more about how computers or technologies can help foster this kind of collaborative learning experience. One of the main findings, I would say, from that area is that people benefit a lot from scaffolds. And again, this gets at that expectations idea. When you know what you're supposed to do, you have an easier time kind of getting into it. And so if you're thinking about this in the context of, say, online learning discussion boards, you could make it explicit what you expect, not just a discussion board that says, hey, respond to something that you thought was interesting, but each comment should look like this. First, I want you to say something positive about another comment. And then I want you to present your own take. And then I want you to discuss how that relates to a different student's comment. And sort of giving that structure can start to help ease this kind of collaborative way of working and kind of understanding how to talk to one another. And the other thing is thinking about, how do you integrate these just more directly into the class? So it can be hard to find opportunities for this, but that's kind of where the creativity can come in, and think about, what are the sort of times that I can have more connection happening in my class? So are there ways to build assignments or activities that rely fundamentally on students engaging with one another? You could have students, for example, interview one another on some topic and then maybe share out their class. And so everybody kind of gets a little bit of knowledge about each other, and that can help build that sense of connection. But what's interesting there is you can also think about the content, right? Is it that they're working together on some exercise? No, it's that they're maybe going beyond something as simple as talk about the weather with one another, to maybe share a little bit about themselves. You don't want to get too personal, you don't want it to be invasive, but something where it's a little bit more actually talking about each individual, and then sharing that more broadly. All right, the last strategy I want to dive into a little bit has to do with this idea of dealing positively with negative emotions. And the reason for this is, obviously, everybody's going to have negative emotions. There's no way around the fact that you're going to have bumps in the road. It's worth acknowledging that, and it's worth thinking about that in the context of resilience, right? We don't want resilience to mean people experience a setback, but they laugh it off and they move on immediately, and they don't really stop and process the fact that this kind of felt bad, right? Everybody's going to encounter difficulties, stressors, and things like that. There's kind of a moment there where what's important is kind of being able to process that in a way that's healthy, adaptive, allows you to keep moving forward, which can be contrasted with the idea of, having that negative reaction and then feeling so overwhelmed that you basically disengage and can't kind of move on anymore. So how do we do that? Well, the idea of emotional intelligence is a relevant idea here. And so researchers who work on this topic have this nice mnemonic I wanted to share, which is RULER, which stands for recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate. And basically recognize here means being able to identify emotions and emotional responses, both in yourself and in others. You can think about this kind of as literally the ability to notice when an emotional reaction is going on, which sounds fundamental, but if you really evaluate things, even yourself, like maybe sometimes you feel angry and you don't totally even notice that it's happening until you're sort of in the middle of that feeling, right? But if you have kind of the ability to regulate a little bit, or regulate means something else in this context, but like to really notice that as it's happening, that's already a big win in the terms of emotional intelligence and in terms of setting yourself up to be able to deal with that kind of a feeling. The next step is understand, which is figuring out those causes and the potential consequences of that emotion. So understanding what is it that's leading you to feel this way, if at all possible in that context, to get to that information quickly. Label, and this is particularly important with younger students, but it's true of really anybody, having the kind of nuanced vocabulary to really identify what you're experiencing. You know, even just feeling anger is kind of pretty broad, like you might feel anger because of disappointment versus anger because of something that's unfair, right? There's kind of a lot of different things that could be going on. Having that nuance to really label exactly what it is that's going on can help you have a better time of understanding it and then dealing kind of proactively and productively with it. Expressing in this context means, yes, talking about it, other ways of kind of sharing what's going on. But what's really critical is also being aware of the context and the culture you're in, right? You don't share necessarily the same way with your loved ones as you do at school, as you do at work, as you know, there's different kind of things. And then also just in terms of cultures, right? You could, in one country or one, school system, certain things are accepted, in other ways, in other places, it's not. And so just being aware of that and understanding, how to express it, but how to do it in a way that fits with what's going on. And then finally, regulate is having those strategies to help you do something with those emotions, whether it's to fully experience them and then move on, whether it's to realize that it's not something that's conductive or conducive to anything good in this environment, and trying to find techniques to calm down in that moment, whatever it is, finding those steps to regulate. And there's a whole lot of different particular approaches that you can kind of look into for those. But one thing I want to do is really step back a little, give that kind of sense of what are some tips that we might learn from all of this. So one, going back a little bit, like those expectations, this idea of classroom norms, but here what I really want to emphasize is this idea of getting people to buy in, getting the students themselves to help set those norms, to say, this is what I want the classroom to be like and feel like, and having everybody kind of be accountable to those things that they themselves have come up with. This is a place where active listening is also really important, and that comes with being kind of honest and explicit and listening deeply, but also responding very sort of empathetically as much as you can. Reflection is important. So what I mean by that is building in those opportunities to pause and ask students, how did you feel while this was going on? For example, you guys all studied for this test. How did that feel? And kind of giving people an opportunity to even reflect on that, to talk about things that worked for them, strategies that were good, or strategies that didn't, and really sharing kind of some of that information. And in terms of unhelpful comparisons, it's useful, for some students, comparison is helpful, right? They see how others are doing. They know they have to step up their game. They feel good about that kind of competitive aspect, but for a lot of students, it won't be. And particularly nowadays with social media, maybe they're comparing themselves to something they've seen on, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is. And that's not really fair, right? Those are curated, weird versions of people that are being shared out into the world. And so helping people really understand, those are not necessarily helpful comparisons. Let's maybe just focus on how we're doing right now, can help kind of reset that. So I want to wrap up with a couple points. So the first one I just want to point out right away is, we're talking about these kinds of ways of helping people who are, again, roughly equivalent, but maybe some have some beliefs or some approaches that aren't kind of setting themselves up quite as well for success as they could be. What I don't want to convey from this is that the idea that educators are somehow responsible for dealing with like serious mental health issues, right? If your students or people are experiencing major depression, anxiety, hopefully you have some ways to connect them with the resources that are more appropriate, that are going to help them get the help that they need. And it's also important to note that fostering student resilience shouldn't mean that if a student is struggling, that's kind of their fault, right? They don't have the resilience that they need. This gets back at that entity growth or fixed mindset idea, like, oh, they're failing, that means there's something wrong with them, right? That's definitely not what it means. First of all, there's just really important contextual factors, right? If a school doesn't have the resources that are going to support a student adequately, even if they're feeling resilient, even if they bounce back from difficulties, what are they going to do? They maybe still can't move on because there's just not enough support in the environment or the right learning materials or whatever it is. So don't want to suggest that, but I do think it's important to think about how can we help the students who are here with us kind of get a little bit more out of the experience if possible. And at this end here, I just want to take a moment to think about like the future, right? And obviously there's a moment with AI, you saw ChatGPT come up earlier. Many people are looking to AI to help with learning, with education, particularly in the domain of individualized tutoring. I think that's a really interesting space. I want to in particular push on the idea that we don't want to look towards solutions that are going to help people become more isolated, to work really well with a very smart machine, but to think about things that take advantage of all the stuff we've been talking about that help empower the student, more of like a virtual agent that's guiding, that's connecting or helping the student to connect to their own personal goals, their values, to promote those confidence, to maybe build an online community of learners together, maybe very adaptively because it's this very smart system. But it's a lot of potential. I think it's early days, and a lot of what you see right now is still more focused on the system and an individual. And I want to see more about kind of how does it support individuals in these broader contexts as well. And in any case, what I definitely don't see is that these tools are going to lessen the critical role of teachers. I think teachers have just the most fundamental role, which is helping students feel empowered, as well as teaching them to tackle the challenges that they face right now and in the future. So thank you very much. And with that, if you're interested in learning more, we do have some resources up already, and I think more will be added in the days and months to come as well.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you very, very much. Can everyone hear me all right? Dan, can you hear me and see me?
Yep.
Good stuff. Well, that's a lot of hearts, that's a lot of claps. You've had a few O's, a few mouth opens there, a few gasps. Thank you so much. That was just a wonderful talk, really nice, really interesting talk, but I think also really helpful for the teachers here with the advice that you're giving them specifically about their learners. So thanks so much for putting it in there, for putting it from looking at it from their perspective. Much appreciated. Time for a couple of questions. Yeah, we've had lots.
Yeah,
I'm going to get through a couple of them.
Sure.
So the process you were talking about when it comes to dealing with negative emotions in class seemed a bit not long-winded, but it can't be solved there and then for the long term. Any advice for the more shorter term at that particular instance during the lesson?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously going to depend so much on the individual and the context. I think helping the person realize if something that's going on is a negative emotion in a way that's sort of disruptive both to that person and maybe to the class more broadly, I think that's got to kind of be the focus, that like, I hear you, this is really tough, but right now we can't have everything kind of stopped for this moment. And so whether that means letting the student maybe take some moments so that it's not a disruption to the rest of the class, and then come back, or other things like that. But it is tough to answer a broad question like that in a broad, in a case like this. I think that's also one of those places where, again, those expectations and those norms can, if they've already been set up, can help, right? If it's clear that you already have a system in place that says when students are feeling like this, we have some resources. Maybe if it's a younger student, like maybe there's some aspect of the classroom that's like the quiet corner that say, you can take some time, sit over there. Whatever it is, it should be dependent on that context. But if you can kind of set up the contingencies ahead of time, it's going to help. If you're trying to figure that out, what to do on the fly, that's going to be really tough. So I think it's one of those things where maybe a little bit of that planning ahead of time, setting those expectations of what's going to happen, how to think about those moments can help. Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Similar to it, you had this question earlier, and it's more about the differentiating different issues and the different issues. So as a whole, only different issues, the different problems that some students experience outside of class, and they bring them in. Obviously, everyone brings in everything there into the classroom. And a teacher needs to try to adapt and to react to an entire class of different backgrounds. Any advice? I think one thing is helping students, like, well, basically understanding some things about those students and what those differences in needs are. But I think this is maybe one of those places where also asking the student for those connections maybe helps, right? So the differentiation that a teacher can do by themselves to say, hey, you go do this, or you're having this challenge, I want you to do this. Maybe this is one of those moments where, again, the student can become part of the solution. What you've seen with the relevance things that I talked about, asking students, what are the connections you can make? Maybe a moment can be, what are the things we can do for you specifically now? And helping the student be part of that problem solving is part of it. And I think the other thing for differentiation, when we talk about, like, say, the growth mindset aspect, is it can feel like some students are making great progress and other students don't feel like they're making as much. And so it can make that a little bit harder. And so to the degree we can really talk to each student about where they are on their journey and really focus on the differentiation, meaning progress from your starting point and from your, where you are at earlier in the semester or earlier today or whatever it is, showing that progress on an individual basis can also be something that hopefully.
Can I ask one question from myself?
Sure.
Kind of straddles your talk and Lyra's that she's going to come on to in a minute, which is, if a student is maybe some way is very clearly experiences some kind of personal issue, an emotional issue of some kind, you can see that happening. Is there some benefit with using a second language than using a first when it comes to asking them to identify and express those?
I think so. I would be curious to see what Dr. Bordisky says. I think that one of the things that can happen when we're having a strong emotional response is we basically are shutting down parts of our sort of more reflective, say, prefrontal cortex, like parts of us that are doing more of that reflective thinking.
Right.
And I can imagine that asking people to express themselves in a different way that requires more of that planning, thinking through your own thoughts could help kind of slow down, maybe tamp down a little bit of the emotional side and really be able to do that. I can imagine that. That would be an interesting question for Dr. Bordisky as well.
Yeah. We'll ask it later. Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for your time and energy today as well. You're doing this talk 3 times. It's a big day for you.